begin because we have a lot to cover, and it's an hour and 50 minutes. It's a short time to do it. So anyway, my name is Chuck Slatkin. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Big Apple Coffee Party to this panel, Koch Brothers, Their Rise to Power. The coffee party began 2 years ago or so. The Big Apple Coffee Party came together locally because we were drawn to the basic tenets of this, which was that we would be civil to each other and be nonpartisan. We followed the lead from its creator, who's here today, Annabelle Park, who started Coffee Party USA. And we came together and realized that the unifying thing for us was working on getting money out of politics, the undue influence that corporations have on society, and very, well, not quickly, but eventually we got to the Koch brothers, and we started among other things we've done, a boycott Coke campaign that Chris Kibler will be speaking to you later. But I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today. He's an independent journalist who appears in Truth Out in these times, many places. You see him a lot, even more frequently now on Tom Hartman Show, MSNBC, and he has a book coming out, a forthcoming book on what's the 2011 Global Democratic Revolution, which will be published by Left Legacy Press. And I'm proud to introduce a friend and colleague, J.A. Myerson.
We are being videotaped, so take that into consideration, especially if you have recently put out viral videos about Uganda. And also do be aware that your cell phone may be on and may cause noise to happen. So do whatever you need to do to forestall that eventuality. Welcome to the Koch brothers, their path to power, an investigation of the far right-wing ideological political financiers in the era of political financierism. I'll introduce you to our, I think, very august panel. On the left there, this is the left forum after all, is Ari Berman of The Nation and Rolling Stone and The Guardian. You've got brief bios in here if you'd like to refer to them. So I think that let's let that suffice for now, and then if critical things come up, you can mention it. To his right is Fang, formerly of Think Progress. Now, where are you? Everywhere. Salon, United Republic, an excellent investigative journalist. And to his right is Brendan Fischer of the Center for Media and Democracy. He's a law fellow and a writer there. And our fourth panelist is appearing in absentia, and it's Robert Greenwald, the filmmaker who runs Brave New Films, who has provided us with some clips relevant to today's topic, and also with his own introduction, custom tailored for our purposes. So, hit it.
Hello, this is Robert Greenwald from Los Angeles. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you today at the Left Forum, but through the magic of technology, I can at least say hello, send my regrets and my support for the wonderful work, the important work that you're doing around the Koch brothers. It's been the last year and a half that we've been investigating, probing, researching, and exposing with the help of many of you on the panel and in the audience. The videos you're going to see today are a part of our work. The rest of the work will be in the full-length film that will be premiering at the end of March with about 30 to 40 groups around the country supporting the efforts. Look, we're never going to have the money to take on the Kochs. We're never going to have anywhere near their billions. But what we do have, and I really believe this passionately, is the ability to reach people, to communicate peer-to-peer, to use social media, and to hopefully use these videos as a way to tell the story and let people know what the Kochs are doing is threatening each and every one of us and our democracy. Thank you.
Our first speaker, Ari Berman, is also the author of the excellent work Herding Donkeys, which anyone who's interested in drawing out the good elements of the Democratic Party ought to read. It's required. So I'll turn it over to Ari, and you have 10 minutes, and
Okay.
we're going to be strict about that.
Got it. Well, thanks for having me, and it's nice to see a packed audience on such a nice day. I would say what's wrong with you guys for being here, but thank you for being here. And we're all gonna talk about different aspects of the Koch brothers because there's a lot of different things that they're up to. What I'm gonna talk about is the Koch brothers and how it pertains to the right to vote and also the 2012 election, because there's been some pretty big changes as it pertains to 2012 in the last few years. So one of the things that I've reported on a lot for The Nation and for Rolling Stone has been the fact that since the 2010 election, we've seen an unprecedented rollback of voting rights all across the country. 38 states introduced legislation to roll back the right to vote in different forms, and more than a dozen states have passed these laws. And that means requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, which is now the case in Kansas, Alabama, and Tennessee. That means cracking down on voter registration drives, which we've seen in Florida and Texas. That means cutting back on early voting, which we've seen in Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Tennessee, and West Virginia. And that means requiring government-issued IDs to register to vote, which we've seen in 9 different states controlled by Republicans. And the last thing that's happened is in 2 other states, Iowa and Florida, ex-felons can no longer vote. And so you add this all up, and really what we're seeing is a very coordinated systemic effort by conservatives to make it harder for predominantly younger people, elderly voters, and minority voters to exercise the right to vote. And it's no coincidence this happened after the 2008 election, when we saw a very large turnout of younger voters and minority voters coming in to elect President Obama and Democratic candidates, and they were referred to as the quote-unquote coalition of the ascendant. And now there's an attempt by conservatives to make the 2012 election and future elections look more like the 2010 election. So make it look wider, more homogenous, and older, and that's what these voting rights restrictions are meant to achieve. And the tie to the Koch brothers is that one of the major sponsors of a lot of these measures has been a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, otherwise known as ALEC, which Brendan's going to also talk more about. But ALEC is a conservative advocacy group that's funded by corporations for state legislatures that exists largely in secret. But we know from documents, thanks to Brendan's group, that the Koch brothers have probably given at least $1 million to ALEC and possibly more. And what ALEC did is, after the 2008 election, one of the things that ALEC does is they draft piece of legislation that then Republican and sometimes Democratic state legislators introduce. And there's an unbelievable range of pieces of legislation that get introduced and passed into law that originated ALEC. And what ALEC did is, in 2008, after a voter ID law was passed in Indiana, that ALEC drafted mock legislation and gave it to different state legislatures. And that legislation formed the basis of laws in at least 5 different states that have passed these photo ID laws since the 2010 election. And what people don't realize is everyone thinks, oh, I have a driver's license, I can vote, but they don't realize that 11% of U.S. citizens, according to the Brennan Center, don't have government-issued ID, and that is higher among young voters. 18% of young voters don't have that ID. 18% of voters 65 or older don't have that ID, and 25% of African-American voters don't have that ID. And so really, this is a way to kind of shape the electorate through deciding who can and can't vote. And ALEC has been one of the main funders and pushers behind this, and the Koch brothers have been very involved in that effort. At the same time that they're trying to restrict who can vote, they've also poured a ton of money into the political process as well. And so we saw, for example, in the 2010 election, that one of the main groups behind the Tea Party, Americans for Prosperity, was funded largely by the Koch brothers. And for all the talk of the Tea Party as a grassroots movement, it really was the funding from the Koch brothers through Americans for Prosperity that made the Tea Party possible. And we're seeing that that's going to be amplified in the 2012 election, because Americans for Prosperity is already running a lot of ads. For example, they ran a $6 million ad campaign criticizing the Obama administration for its loan to Solyndra, and I think we should pretty much expect that in this super PAC era, this money is going to increase. The Koch brothers have already said, for example, that they are going to spend $60 million personally, and they will raise $100 million to spend against President Obama in 2012. The Obama people say it'll be higher. They'll say that it'll be $500 million from the Koch brothers and from conservative causes, just against President Obama and Democratic candidates. And you know, whatever you think of the president, pro or con, I mean, this is just a staggering amount of money that is now entering the political system. We've already seen Mitt Romney cozy up to the Koch brothers and cozy up to those elements. He has held 3 different meetings with Americans for Prosperity. And the third Koch brother, there's Charles Koch, there's David Koch, and there's Bill Koch, who doesn't get as much. There's actually 4 Koch brothers, but 3 are involved in politics. Interestingly enough, Charles and David Koch have thus far sat out, to the best of my knowledge, the presidential election in terms of giving money to candidates, although I think we should pretty much expect that that's going to change at some point. But the third Koch brother, Bill Koch, has given $1 million already to the pro-Romney super PAC, Restore Our Future, and so this money probably is just going to increase as time goes on. And so, you know, the things that I'm following with regards to the Koch brothers is what's their role in restricting the right to vote, and what's their role as well in terms of pouring so much money into the 2012 election. And I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Ari. All right, I believe that signals another video clip from Robert Greenwald. This, I think, will not be him addressing us, but part of his documentary about the Koch brothers.
We have recently seen an ambush of voter registration and voter ID restrictions in states across the country.
The torrent of new voter suppression laws across the country.
Voters will now be required to show an ID at the polls.
Maine is also poised to make it much harder to vote.
The laws seem designed to hit minority populations.
They hit elderly people. They hit students extra hard.
A push to make it as difficult as possible to vote.
It disenfranchises a whole sector of the American electorate.
We're in a moment right now where we're seeing the most aggressive attempt to roll back voting rights in this country that we've seen in over a century.
My Missouri ID is currently expired now, and for me to get all the documents that I need for my current ID is a big struggle.
As somebody who lives in a dorm at college, we do not have any proof of our current address on campus.
In order to get a Texas identification, you must be a Texas resident, and if I file for Texas residency, then that would throw off all the money that I'm getting in grants.
I would have considerable difficulty getting a state-issued ID because there is a glitch on my birth certificate.
The people most impacted by these new voter suppression tactics are African Americans, Latinos, elderly, young voters, and those with disabilities. The Koch brothers are behind these kinds of laws because they want to cut off the participation of people who are not behind their corporate agenda.
The American Legislative Exchange Council is called ALEC. It really is an exchange between corporations and politicians who both vote on legislation to rewrite our rights.
ALEC put forth a template for voter ID restrictions and push that through to the states so that state legislators would pick it up and pass it. We see these laws being passed that make it harder for Americans to vote, harder for Americans to participate and to have a voice and to have power.
Koch Industries has had a seat on ALEC's corporate board. Both the company and foundations that are associated with Charles Koch have made substantial donations to ALEC.
Folks like the Koch brothers are attempting to ensure that as few people of color and as few young people show up as possible.
Protecting the integrity of each and every vote cast in this state certainly is worthy of a simple requirement that we show photo identification as defined under this bill.
I pledge to reform state government, and this voter ID bill will help us achieve that goal.
We instituted a photo ID requirement for every voter.
These voter suppression laws are turning our country backwards.
It's me versus billionaires. And now it's the Koch brothers and ALEC who get to decide that this is not a valid form of ID.
I do think that this is an opportunity for people to take away people that are disabled with their voting rights.
The reason that you target somebody's voting rights is it makes it easier to take away the rest of their rights. You come for that first, and the whole house of cards starts to fall.
Voting is my right, guaranteed to me by my government, and I'm furious that it might be taken away.
I think furious is a well-chosen word there. Here to make us slightly more furious, Brendan Fischer.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Kochs and Wisconsin. So like the video said, the Kochs gave $43,000 to get Scott Walker elected. They also gave $1 million to the Republican Governors Association, which in turn spent $65,000 supporting Walker and $3.4 million attacking his opponent. And then after Walker was voted into office, one of the many bills from the ALEC playbook that he introduced, or that he called for the introduction of, was voter ID. It was one of 34 states to introduce it, one of 8 to pass it, and most, if not all of these states, based their voter ID bill off of a ALEC model. So the ALEC has long been a conduit for the Kochs and many other corporate interests to push their regressive agenda. It's what we call the corporate bill mill. It essentially allows corporations to hand state legislators changes to the state laws that they desire and that tend to benefit their bottom line. Corporations and legislators have equal membership in ALEC. They sit on all 9 ALEC task forces where they vote with legislators as equals to approve model bills. And then ALEC's 2,000 legislative members, who are overwhelmingly Republican, then bring these bills home to their state and introduce them as their own brilliant ideas with no indication that these bills came from ALEC or that corporations had pre-approved them. So the Center for Media and Democracy published over 800 of these previously secret bills last July. So we finally have the tools to start to match up these streams of influence. And we also been able to recognize just how vast this attack is on all of our rights. So the Koch brothers have funded ALEC to the tune of over $1 million, and it's been a way that they've been able to help roll back environmental regulations, which benefits Koch Industries, which is a major polluter. It's been an avenue by which they've been able to push tort reform, which makes it harder to sue corporations when they kill or maim. The Koch brothers have gotten in a lot of trouble in the past when their pipelines have exploded and people have gotten killed. So the laws that would require the Kochs to compensate the people who are killed are not convenient. So they want to change those laws, and ALEC has been a way that they've been able to do it. ALEC has also been an avenue by which they've been able to privatize education, which has long been on the Koch agenda. School vouchers were part of David Koch's platform when he ran for president in 1980 on the Libertarian ticket. The Koch's father, who was a founding member of the John Birch Society, thought the National Education Association was communist. And ALEC has also been really behind the privatize everything movement, including the privatization of prisons. Another ALEC member is Corrections Corporation of America, and they were on the task force that approved Arizona's SB 1070, which had the effect of putting more immigrants in jail. and also a lot of the tough on crime bills in the early 90s that put more people in prison for more time. Bills like truth in sentencing or 3 strikes you're out. And in Wisconsin in the 90s, guess who introduced the ALEC model truth in sentencing bill when he was a state legislator? It was Scott Walker, who is an ALEC alum. And then union busting is also an important part of the ALEC agenda and the Koch agenda. And when Walker was elected into office in 2010 with Koch backing, that's one of the pieces of the Koch agenda and ALEC agenda that he put forth. So in 2010, for the first time in years, in Wisconsin, the governor's office, the assembly, and the Senate all went Republican. Walker was an ALEC alum. The speaker of both chambers were ALEC alumni. And then Walker named other ALEC alum to key positions. So the state government was basically entirely controlled by people with connections to ALEC and through ALEC connections to the Kochs. And Walker didn't campaign on union busting, but there was some indication of what was coming after the elections when the Speaker of the Assembly, or the Speaker of the Senate, said in an interview that, "I just went to the American Legislative Exchange Council conference, and there was a lot of momentum for right to work." And then soon after that, we saw what happened in Wisconsin and elsewhere. So as many of you know, in February of last year, Walker introduced drastic changes to public sector collective bargaining on a Friday with plans to pass it the following Tuesday. 14 Democratic senators fled the state. There were months of protests, massive protests like Wisconsin hadn't seen almost ever. Hundreds of thousands of people, normal people, teachers, firefighters, police officers marching around the Capitol and protesting this attack on Wisconsin's traditions and on labor rights. And as soon as this started happening, the Koch's American for Prosperity Tea Party group planned to stand with Walker counter rally. And as Ari mentioned, the AFP is the way that they've been funding the Tea Party. David Koch's on the board of AFP. They've given significant funding to the group, and they founded the organization that in the 1980s that gave birth to AFP. So in the first weeks of the protests, AFP planned to rally with Sarah Palin, with Herman Cain, who would later say he was the Koch's brother from another mother, and others, to give the appearance of Walker having support. And of course, Fox News covered the counter rally as an indication that the people of Wisconsin really are with Scott Walker. And if you're actually there, you would see that the anti-Walker protesters vastly outnumbered the AFP Tea Party protesters. And then during the same period, Walker accepted a prank call from a person who he thought was David Koch, which was recorded, and which was really candid and really gave a pretty good view into the way Walker's mind worked. So this union busting and other right-wing initiatives that Walker pushed from the ALEC and Koch playbook, like voter ID, like tort reform, like environmental deregulation, led the people of Wisconsin to start a recall effort against Walker. And here, too, the Kochs had Walker's back. As people started gathering recall signatures in November, AFP flooded Wisconsin TV stations with ads proclaiming it's working, that the collective bargaining reform saved money, that they've avoided saving taxes, that they've avoided, that they've done away with the deficit. I mean, these ads didn't mention that Walker's reforms had led to 6 straight months of job losses under Walker, but they were really well done, they were really effective, and they're still ongoing. The other part about these ads is they're put on by the AFP Foundation, which is a 501c3, which is a charity. And as a charity, donations to it are tax deductible, which basically means that the Kochs are able to influence Wisconsin's elections and write it off on their taxes and avoid paying taxes into the public funds. So they've spent well over $1 million so far this year on these AFP It's Working ads. And they're going to continue to spend more. And then in February this year, David Koch told a Florida newspaper that we spent a lot of money in Wisconsin, and we're going to spend more. And he, like many others, views Wisconsin as a battleground over the future of labor, and said that what Scott Walker is doing with the unions is critically important. And if the unions win the recalls, there will be no stopping them. So they've been involved, and they're going to continue to be, and that's that.
That means we've got another clip. This, I think, not focused on voter ID laws, but about education.
The Koch brothers have been very clever at designing their grant agreements with universities in such a way that they will exercise maximal control and influence on campus. Many of these grants come with very significant strings attached. They have very clear stipulations that give the Koch brothers excessive control over various aspects of the university's internal affairs.
A school that I take so much pride in and that I believe in had effectively sold its soul to the Koch brothers for a few $1 million.
They're help setting up a pattern where universities are expected to give up their values in exchange for money. Programs that they start tend to be one point of view only.
They now have financial agreements with over 150 colleges and universities.
They've spent tens of millions of dollars to get their point of view instilled in classrooms, amongst faculty members, and in students.
The size and scope of these deals is quite significant.
Thousands of students pass through those programs every year, and over time, hundreds of thousands of students are directly exposed to Koch brothers' ideology and political points of view. The university signs a contract that says they will hire someone who shares the point of view of the Koch brothers.
They have an immense amount of influence over who those professors are and what they teach and what they publish and what research they do and what they say in the classroom.
We depend on universities to provide a kind of knowledge that is not owned or bought or sold.
Since the Renaissance, we've had academics who do research independently, and we learn as a society from them. What the Koch brothers have done is strip that segment of society in a way so as to promote their own ideological agenda.
This is a major threat to the country, not just to the educational system or to the students or to the faculty. This is a major threat to our way of life. They are trying to use their money to influence the flow of American democracy.
All right. I actually don't think it's hyperbolic to claim that they're trying to roll back to the Renaissance as they're trying to. Very reactionary. All right. Third speaker, Fang. Hit it.
All right. Well, thank you, Lynn, Annabelle, and Coffee Party for having us, and thanks for everyone coming here. I just want to take a quick step back and talk about the Koch brothers and why they're significant, because there are many billionaires or very wealthy individuals and corporations that fund conservative causes. I mean, this has gone on for a long time. But why are we talking about the Koch brothers? Who are they? David and Charles Koch run the second largest privately held corporation in America, Koch Industries, and they're very diversified. They have timber interests, oil refining, pipelines, fertilizer, chemical production, and a large commodity speculating arm. And it obviously makes a lot of money. Each Koch brother, they jointly control the company, is worth approximately $22 to $25 billion. If they decided to sell the company, they'd be worth gobs more. Who knows? But as Brendan noted, their interest in funding these conservative causes goes way back to the father, Fred Koch. He started the John Birch Society and instilled this kind of very rabid ideology in his sons. The sons have pictures of the father all over their headquarters. They worship him. They've written books about him. They have their own certain ideology that's kind of an amalgamation of a lot of different ideas. Charles Koch calls his personal ideology the science of liberty. It's what he thinks is a form of libertarianism, but better. To think about the Koch strategy for influencing politics and policy and even culture, one, I think, useful tool is to look at the words of Richard Fink. He's an Austrian economist who's worked, he's an American economist, but he subscribes to the Austrian School of Economics, who's worked with the Koch brothers for a very long time, since the late 70s when they started founding think tanks and really seriously funding different conservative organizations. Well, Richard Fink has explained the Koch strategy, and what he says is that they take the industrial process and they apply it to politics. So the mining of raw materials, they translate that into funding scholars, professors, as you saw in that film. They give out millions of dollars in grants to students as young as 16. They give out grants to high schoolers to write essays, to college students to attend university. They have summer camps and that sort of thing, but it goes all the way up to funding fellowships and that sort of thing for more senior academics. They fund think tanks to package those raw ideas and to create fully formed policies and different policy products. So you have everything from the Cato Institute, which was founded by Charles Koch, to many different think tanks that they fund, everything from the American Enterprise Institute, the Manhattan Institute, what have you. And then along the process of this industrial process that they've transformed for their intellectual ideas, they have the distribution and marketing. So they fund, obviously, politicians. They're one of the biggest funders of the Republican Party and for congressional Republicans. They fund grassroots groups. Americans for Prosperity is one of the most prominent ones, but there are many smaller ones that they fund on the state level. And then, of course, they have ads, lots and lots of ads and marketing. So, you know, they use different vehicles. Sometimes it's groups like Americans for Prosperity running an ad, selling an idea. Maybe it's against cap and trade or against the stimulus or just supporting a congressional Republican. That kind of is a quick overview. I mean, there are dozens of groups that they fund with their own specific agenda. They even fund a small think tank in Hollywood that develops more conservative movie ideas. So, you know, it's quite expansive. And, you know, if you want to just apply the Koch model for advancing policy and ideas, we could think back into the 2010 elections. And I'm just going to give you a quick example I've given before. Lots of very competitive races, of course, in 2010. You had a lot of Democrats who came in 2006 and 2008, and they had kind of swing seats, you could say. So you had this one seat, Betsy Markey. She had just won her election in 2008, freshman Democrat, you know, pretty loyal Democrat, whatever. But she had a competitive race with with a competitor named with an opponent named Cory Gardner, and so the Koch method was applied to some 40 or 50 races, and this is almost identical, whether it's Colorado, Florida, upstate New York. A local think tank that was funded by the Koch brothers, it's called the Independent Institute of Colorado. They've got dozens of these. They actually sent out their scholars to Betsy Markey's district to start organizing Tea Party rallies. They put out a study about how Betsy Markey was destroying American prosperity and killing jobs. They organized 3 different bus tours, one of them called End Spending, another one called Remember November. It's kind of bland names, but they're quite effective because the way the Kochs did this was they organized these bus tours as a nonprofit, so they didn't have to report any of this campaign spending to the FEC. So it went on almost in an invisible way. A lot of reporters didn't even notice it was happening. But this bus tours, if you looked at their stops, as they crisscrossed the country, they stopped in every single competitive race where the Republicans, where the Kochs wanted to influence a congressional Democrat and take them out. So you had lots of money from the Koch Political Action Committee flowing to Cory Gardner, the Republican in that race. You had these bus tours constantly stopping. You had this local think tank organizing rallies and putting out papers. And then you saw the ad war. And in the last 2 months of the campaign, it was just brutal because 60 Plus Association this organization that is kind of a catch-all conservative front group, but at that year they were being funded by the Koch brothers. In previous years they've been funded by the pharmaceutical lobby and what have you. But that year they were funded by the Koch brothers to just go on air and say, you know, Betsy Markey is hurting seniors. They also funded another women's group, Independent Women's Forum, to say Betsy Markey is hurting women. So you had this amalgamation of different efforts from local think tanks, national think tanks, random issue groups, Tea Party groups, bus tours, and then just cold cash straight to the Republican challenger. And of course, Betsy Markey is no longer in the House, like many other congressional Democrats targeted by the Koch brothers. And this model of taking a multifaceted approach to affecting politics has been applied in other ways. I mean, this is just an election I'm talking about, but they've done this in a number of different policy areas. Just to give another quick example, there was a big legislative fight in the beginning of 2010. Now, in 2009, the window of opportunity for people to pass, for Congress to pass comprehensive climate change legislation to cap greenhouse gases was stalling and approaching failure. And that's a whole nother conversation. But the Environmental Protection Agency had a mandate through the Clean Air Act to act anyways. Even if Congress failed, they were supposed to take up their responsibility through the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. So obviously the Koch brothers don't want that because they've basically diversified their business interests in polluting the environment and cutting down trees. So what they did was, again, lots of studies, lots of ads, but then they just designed a bus tour, and it was quite populist. It was this anti-regulation bus tour, but it only visited the states of swing Democratic senators that they needed to sign onto a resolution blocking the EPA from acting on the Clean Air Act. So they went to Arkansas, where at the time Senator Blanche Lincoln was on the fence for supporting this effort to roll back the Clean Air Act. And they actually had rallies where they had a moon bounce, and they had food, and it was like a good country party where people would come in, bring their kids, jump on the moon bounce. Americans for Prosperity staffers there, they kind of changed their name, but they were okay. I'm almost out of time, so I'll finish this really quickly. They had a moon bounce. They had music, but then they also dressed up as climate cops. They said, we're from the EPA. If the Clean Air Act continues to stand, the EPA will send police, climate cops, to your community, and they'll shut down your church. If you use a refrigerator or anything that uses electricity, they're coming to your house and measure everything. And if you're using too much electricity, they'll shut you down too. And it sounds silly, but you know, this is the diversified strategy of the Koch brothers. They can have an uptown approach in D.C. where they've got very formal, very prestigious-looking studies that they're sending to Capitol Hill and sending to the press, getting quotes from the New York Times, and at the same time they're pressuring lawmakers with cash, lots of contributions, with ads. But then these very sophisticated, actually, rallies that are meant to gin up anger and generate phone calls to Blanche Lincoln to roll back the Clean Air Act.
So the rest of this event will consist for a time of me asking the panel some questions that I have, and then subsequently of you asking the panel some questions that you have. So I'll start. That is fast. I didn't know about the moon bounce, but I didn't know about the sort of ecological death panel construct. When they're the ones who want to control your ability to control your reproductive cycle. Only ones who are invasive that way. Okay, yes. Oh, fantastic.
Actually, I have 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes? Okay. Maybe in about 10 minutes we'll pause so that people can sort of shift in a little bit if they'd like. So I'll ask one question and then we'll do that. It's a question about the ideological purity of the Kochs. You mentioned that they were libertarians, and in fact one, was it Charles or David, ran for president? David on the Libertarian Party line. It seems like there are libertarian corporatists who want government out of the way so that their corporations can flourish, and there are pro-big government corporatists who want a big, sprawling government that they can make a lot of money off of. And I'm interested in the sort of the purity of the libertarian ideology there, and why, for instance, you suspect the Kochs haven't written a $100 million check in secret to Revolution PAC, the Ron Paul supporting super PAC. Why haven't they done that?
I can suggest why. You know, number one, although Charles Koch calls himself a libertarian or someone who believes in the science of liberty, whatever, he also compares himself to Martin Luther, the theologian. He's this type of libertarian where he can do no wrong, but he can dictate to the government what he doesn't like. And Koch Industries is a great exemplar of why they're not libertarian. They take tens of millions of dollars in government subsidies. They're a big contractor to the Defense Department. After the invasion of Iraq, they were one of the first ones to go in and start buying up Iraqi oil. So, you know, they're not against war. Look at the candidates they support. You know, if you're a libertarian, even a right-winger, whatever, supposedly you're not supposed to like torture, government spying, neoconservative adventures all over the world, conquering countries. So at least theoretically, you're supposed to at least kind of like senators like Russ Feingold, who was the best on all those issues. Russ Feingold in 2010 faced a neocon, Ron Johnson, supports the Patriot Act, supports war, supports Gitmo.
Owns a prison, right?
Oh, I don't know about that, but I wouldn't be surprised. But the thing is, here's a great example where the Kochs could walk the walk, be a libertarian, and actually support a libertarian Democrat on these issues. They didn't. They funded Ron Johnson, and they went in hard to make sure Ron Johnson won that race. And he won.
We want to make the case that they're more ideologically pure than we.
Well, I think they started off as more libertarian, and progressively, I think what's happened, and I think we've seen this happen in the broader conservative movement in general, is that libertarianism merged into republicanism. And in fact, the pieces of libertarianism that they latched onto were the ones that were in the self-interest of their business. So they were libertarian when it came to the free market, but not when it came to women's rights. And the Kochs did fund some major libertarian issues for a long time. For example, skepticism about the war on drugs. But what we've seen increasingly is that that's in the background of what they're doing. They don't care as much, for example, about the war on drugs as they do about repealing regulations and defanging the EPA. And this is playing out right now in a really interesting way with the Cato Institute. Probably you guys have seen the New York Times stories, but there's a fight between the Koch brothers and the Cato Institute about who should have control of the Cato Institute's board. Now, the Cato Institute, I think, is really a more libertarian think tank. I don't know, you guys might disagree, but I think they're pretty principled. They are definitely a front group for corporations, but they also are very skeptical of the war on drugs, and they are very absolutist in terms of free speech, and they are pretty dovish when it comes to foreign policy. So I do think they have a pretty consistent libertarian line. Now, is it Charles or David Koch or both of? I forget. I think they're. Which one's on the board? Do you
David's
remember?
on the board. Charles left the board in '91 after he got in dispute with Ed Crane.
Yeah. So anyway, they're trying to assert their authority on the board because they've basically been checked by the guy who is running Cato now. And what they want is for the Cato Institute to become more integrated with the rest of the Republican and conservative think tanks. So to function much more like the Heritage Foundation, for example, and to be supplying Republicans with more talking points and with more intellectual ammunition on a wide range of subjects, and to be part of that broader conservative message machine, which goes from the Heritage Foundation to Fox News to Mitt Romney, and that's how they disseminate information. And there are attempts by Cato to try to challenge this, but what we're seeing right now is the Kochs pushing libertarianism into Republicans, and I do think if they're successful at winning control of Cato, we're going to see much more that libertarianism in the Republican Party become more of an outlier, and even the Ron Paul people will have less influence than they do now in the Republican Party.
Yeah, and I think I think something Koch supporters would probably tell you is that they did oppose the Patriot Act, but they didn't really. They didn't oppose it because it was an infringement on liberty. They opposed it because it gave the government the opportunity to dig into business records, looking for, looking for some sort of terrorist activity. But there were no protections against if the government, as they were going through the business records, found an SEC violation or something like that, that they couldn't prosecute it. So that's the reason they opposed the Patriot Act, not because it was any sort of infringement on any notion of liberty.
This one, I'll start with Brendan, talking about the It's Working ads in Wisconsin. I'm not sure if anyone saw this, but the GOP just lost the Senate in Wisconsin the other day.
Yay.
And
somebody resigned.
Who won the Senate? What's that?
Recalls? Who won the Senate?
No, a candidate resigned, and so it's now evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, and they have a sort of dual chair. So that happened. The recall efforts are draw on apace with really impressive ferocity. I mean, the number. I mean, they got a million signatures to recall Scott Walker, who only initially received 1.2 million votes. So it's not working, as it happens. So I guess I'll ask a question that sort of has come out of me given these thoughts, and you can answer it however you choose. Does the Tea Party exist anymore?
Well, I mean, I think part of the reason the Tea Party ever existed is because there were a bunch of angry people, and the way that the Tea Party handlers and the way AFP really functioned is by riling people up, like Lee mentioned, thinking that the government is going to come in and shut down your church because they're using a refrigerator. And I think that's kind of the tactic that Walker used and that AFP supported, that, I'm unemployed, I don't have health insurance, why should my taxpayer dollars be going to pay for a teacher's health insurance? Like, they're greedy, they're overcompensated, like, I'm suffering, they should suffer too. And I think that they were really able to divide people that way and rile them up. So I mean, I think to the extent that the Tea Party was just a bunch of angry people, that still exists, and I think there's still out of state, usually DC-based interests that are sort of setting the agenda for what happens. Like the rally that I mentioned. I mean, this was not, in the rallies that happened in Wisconsin were, for the most part, genuinely grassroots rallies that happened of people coming together, people protesting something they saw as an injustice. The AFP rally was, put together by an out-of-state group. It was really flashy. There was a huge TV screen. There was Sarah Palin. There were speakers from around the country, and they bussed people in. So I think when you have that many resources and you have people that are angry and you're able to bring them all together in one place, you have the appearance of a movement. But I think all you really have is just a bunch of angry people and a lot of money.
I would disagree with that slightly, in the sense that I do think this idea that the Tea Party is on the wane has been exaggerated. And I think it's been exaggerated, number one, in the coverage of the presidential campaign, because there's been a lot of talk of, oh, well, the Tea Party can't coalesce around a candidate, and why is Mitt Romney winning if the Tea Party is opposed to him? But what's being missed, I think, is how successful the Tea Party has been at dictating the agenda with regards to the Republican nomination. I mean, there really isn't one issue that Mitt Romney disagrees now with the Tea Party on. I mean, he's moved towards the Tea Party on immigration, he's moved towards the Tea Party on women's rights issues, he's moved towards the Tea Party on gay rights issues. Then the idea that the Tea Party, for example, is less hawkish is not true. We know that the Tea Party is just as hawkish as the neocons are. The idea that the Tea Party is more focused on economic issues than social issues is not true. The Tea Party, in fact, cares just as much about social issues as Christian conservatives are, and what we saw, in fact, is that a lot of people who were traditional Christian conservatives rebranded themselves as Tea Partiers after the 2008 election because it sounded better, and it sounded better to call yourself a Tea Partier instead of a Republican after 8 years of George W. Bush. But so I do think their influence in terms of pushing the party of the right is as prevalent as ever. I also think on the local level, yes, as Brendan mentioned, there has been a lot of attempts by people in D.C. to manipulate local Tea Parties. That said, the Tea Party has been very successful at taking over local Republican parties, and they still have a tremendous amount of say in terms of who runs for office and who wins office at the state legislative level and at the congressional level, and I do think that's going to continue into 2012. And so to some extent, even if they're out of the headlines a little bit, their influence on the local level and their ability to be a conduit for corporate interest remains very large.
I just want to add really quickly, the Tea Party served a very important function for the Koch brothers as they were trying to build opposition to President Obama early in this presidency. In December of 2008, right after the election, Koch funded organizers all over the country, and they fanned out trying to organize opposition to Obama. At the time, they didn't have a brand. They called it the Stop the Porculus movement, because back then the stimulus was being proposed. Not a great brand. But they put the resources behind it. They put buses out. They had actually an ad with just like a regular guy yelling into the screen about how Al Gore and a bunch of celebrities want to shove this new Obama green agenda down their throat, and that it's all these wealthy people in Hollywood, but it's really ironic because it's funded by the Koch brothers. But the point being, eventually, as the Tea Party picked up, they all switched from Stop the Porculus to Tea Party. It made more sense. And that served a very important role in fighting health reform, fighting labor reform, fighting all these big Obama agenda items, defeating or watering down almost all of them, and then electing the Tea Party Congress. But again, the Tea Party might wane, it might not, we don't know. That being said, there are other goals for the Koch brothers this year, primarily defeating Obama. So what the Koch brothers are doing right now is that they're funding organizers to go into the Republican primaries and just collect voter data. Just going and seeing who's voting, talking to which activists are the most active in supporting Santorum or whoever, and getting as much information as possible, because they're building their own database to do their own massive national get out the vote effort come this November. So they're laying low, but they're coordinating their strategy because it's a different year. I mean, in a midterm in 2009, that's a time when you need to get your base out. This is in a presidential, it's just a different dynamic.
That sounds like a wise move. I have to say, if I had several $1 billion, that seems like exactly the kind of thing that I would do with my money.
They're certainly getting more bang for their buck than Sheldon Adelson right
now. Well, maybe not if you take a look at the Middle East.
Yeah.
Also, ALEC seems like quite a good idea to me. An organization that takes ideological interests and pumps out model legislation to state legislatures to do what they see as improving conditions. If I had money, I might set up an ALEC for, I might endow Demos with however much money so that they could churn out, I would love if suddenly Tennessee were, all the Democrats there were bloviating about some piece of legislation that Heather McGhee had written. That sounds great to me. What in principle is wrong with ALEC?
What in principle is wrong? I mean, I think they've sometimes been portrayed as, well, there have been a few ways they've been portrayed. I mean, one is that they're a think tank, and they're really not. They're not like the Heritage Foundation, where they're developing the ideas. It's really it's a conduit. It's a way for corporations to communicate almost directly with state legislators. And if they were to do that if they were to do that in all 50 states, if corporations were to come to legislators, push their interests, hand them out legislation, it would be called lobbying, and there would be some sort of transparency attached to it. And with ALEC, there is no transparency. It happens outside of the view of the press, outside of the view of the public. A lot of what's happening is not being reported. And then you have the extra layer on top of lobbying, which is an attempt to exert influence. You also have, like most of the legislators who are attending ALEC are doing it on a scholarship, on a corporate-funded scholarship. So their expenses are being paid by the same corporations that are funding, that are trying to push these model bills. So it's level of influence on top of level of influence, and I think it's probably 4 or 5 steps beyond what is necessary. I think there's like what they would say, what ALEC's defense would be is that the public sector deserves to hear from the private sector. The regulators should hear from the regulated, and they already do. Like corporations already have probably way too much access as it is to to make their views heard among legislators. And with ALEC, they not only are getting their views heard, they're backing it up with tons and tons of money and tons of really fancy perks. And I think that's one of that's the big problem.
Brendan, why do you think that all of a sudden we're here? Sorry to usurp your moderator roles. Why do you think we're hearing so much more about ALEC now? They've obviously been around for quite a long time. Is it just because Republicans took over so many states and were able to pass more pieces of ALEC-sponsored legislation after 2010?
I think that's a big part of it, because there have been a number of different groups that have been sort of like trying to call the alarm about ALEC for a long time. There's a lot of really great reports from the late 90s and the early 2000s, put out by the Natural Resources Defense Council, by Progressive States Network, by the Trialers Association, that were really thorough, that really like laid out how terrible ALEC is, but no one paid attention. And I think like what Lee was saying, they kind of laid the groundwork for a long time. They had a lot of ALEC legislators who were coming up through the ranks and already primed to be a conduit for the corporate agenda, and then in 2010 they got into positions of leadership and positions of power, and that's definitely what happened in Wisconsin.
I mean, because that's one of the things I noticed in following these voting restrictions laws is that Republicans had been introducing them pretty much since 2000 like clockwork, and they were just getting blocked or they were getting vetoed. And so the only thing that really changed was the fact that they were in power, and it's perhaps maybe an instructive lesson for progressives that like maybe you have to introduce something 5 or 6 times before it's passed, and just keep building support for it, and then you get in a position where you elect more of your own kind, and then these things can pass.
And also to monitor more heavily the activities of the failing minority, on the supposition that one day they won't be such a failing minority, and these measures might hold more weight.
Well, I think also if us in the press, and then also if progressive-minded politicians had paid more attention to ALEC previously, and obviously you guys were, then we would have seen more of this coming. And I think what happened, generally speaking, after the 2010 election is Democratic politicians were caught totally blindsided by what the GOP was introducing in places like Wisconsin, and really it's taken them a long time to coordinate any sort of coherent response, and in some cases they haven't even been able to organize a coherent response. And if they had just looked at what was being proposed at ALEC conferences, they would have known, well, this is what's coming down the pike, and maybe they wouldn't have been able to stop it, but they could have done a better job at raising alarms about it.
We're good on the tape. We'll get to my last question, and then we'll turn it over. My last question is the ultimate question, which is, what is to be done? How do you? It doesn't strike me that any of this stuff is illegal, unless it is, in which case please tell me. I think that they're probably on pretty sound, pretty sturdy ground in all of the things that they do, however nefarious. What do we do about this?
Well, I think with ALEC, I mean, one way that you can have an impact is by cutting off their funding, and I think there's groups that are doing that because they're 98% funded by corporate interests, and because they're introducing so much terrible legislation that has such an impact on so many people, and we finally know about it. We finally know that it's coming from ALEC. There's been different campaigns targeting ALEC corporations, especially the ones who are concerned about the public image, and saying, you paying membership dues to ALEC is funding voter suppression. It's funding environmental rollback, and especially for organizations that, like State Farm, who like try to present this family image, or some of the other corporations that try and present a green image. Even if they're involved in ALEC for a really narrow purpose, like the fact that their membership dues are making all of this terrible legislation happen, is really effective, and I think like that kind of public pressure can work.
I can't give a certain suggestion on how to deal with the Koch brothers, but there's this larger structural issue that's raised by them. Everyone talks about super PACs, these big Citizens United created entities that can raise unlimited funds and spend unlimited funds. One benefit is that they're transparent. You can go on the FEC website. The reporting periods are a little bit weird, so you have to wait a while, and they update every month or something. But at least we eventually know who's paying for these ads and who's buying our democracy.
for a lot of these issues, both on the right and the left. The Koch brothers are particularly good, but they're not the only ones, at just hiding their money. They're spending tens, hundreds, maybe more, millions of dollars through 501c3, 501c4, and 501c6 nonprofits, so they don't have to disclose anything. And you know what, again, is unique about the Koch brothers is that they hold these twice annual mega fundraisers with Republican billionaires. I went to the last one in January. I was kicked out, but I did get a little bit of information. But they pool the money from these mega fundraisers. Steve Schwartzman, the big private equity boss here in Manhattan, all these big Republican billionaires get together and they pool their money that then can be funneled through several different foundations and then spent to viciously attack Democrats or pass really reactionary legislation. So I'm a big supporter of radical transparency. A lot of these think tanks on the left should disclose too, because they don't disclose as well. But that won't stop anyone from doing anything in particular, but I think it will lead to a more informed public, so we can at least understand what's going on in our own democracy.
I would add a few things. Number one, you can boycott Koch Industries products. I just realized that my napkins that I had bought were owned by Koch. And so I'm not buying those napkins anymore. I don't like to buy napkins in general because it's a waste. So I think there's a website devoted to all the different. Do you know the URL for it?
Chris at the end. He'll
Yeah. So anyway, that's one thing to do. I also just think that in the long run, the only way that progressive pieces of legislation and progressive changes are going to happen on any sort of consistent basis is if we figure out a way to get money out of politics or to have less money in the political system writ large, because we're probably never going to get it out, but can we cut back on it? And that's something that I think has been people are increasingly aware of that now in a way that they weren't even in 2008. I think that's been one of the best things that Occupy Wall Street has done, is just put a spotlight on the relationship between dysfunction in our economic system and dysfunction in our political system. And it's not going to happen in one election, but if you were going to ask me what's the 10-year, what's the 20-year plan of the progressive movement, what should it be, I would say the number one issue should be cracking down on money in politics. And you're going to have a multi-pronged strategy, and I'm sure there's other panels that are discussing this here, whether it's to work through the legislative system, whether it's to work on a constitutional amendment, whether it's to work on different forms. And Lee is part of a group, United Republic, that is thinking a lot about these issues now, I think, in innovative ways. And I think the third thing is the influence of the Koch brothers should be a wake-up to progressive funders to get in the game and to think more strategically. There's a lot of money on the progressive side. George Soros has more money than the Koch brothers do, but he's funding prison reform in Hungary right now. And I don't think there's anything wrong. No, he funds a lot of things. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I don't think that the progressive community has thought as strategically about how to get as much bang for its buck as the conservatives have. And I think the Koch brothers are a model. They're not a model that you'd want to emulate in terms of doing what they've done, but I think that people should study them and see what they've been able to do over a 20 to 30-year process. I mean, they've had to do a lot of experimentation. It's not like they suddenly were successful. I mean, this is a culmination of a lot of failures as well, and learning from their mistakes. And the Tea Party is a part of a sort of 20-year strategy that finally succeeded. So I do think there has to be more of a willingness from the progressive funding community to stick with things, to be okay with failing, and then to keep pushing legislation until it catches on.
Very good. So I guess now we'll turn it over to the crowd for questions. I think I'll probably be pretty strict about cutting you off if you do what we on the left like to do, which is talk for a long time instead of ask a question. So why don't we start all the way over there?
Ari, you talked about getting money out of politics, and I wanted to ask you about your view on Citizens United and its effects.
I think Citizens United was a terrible decision. I think it's one of the worst decisions in the history of our country by the Supreme Court. And I also think, from a legal perspective, from everything I know, it was also a very bad decision, that it was perhaps very sketchy precedent that it was relied on to get that case, and they took a small case on a narrow issue, and they expanded this blanket rule about that completely transformed American politics. I mean, it was one of the most stunning examples of judicial activism that we've ever seen by so-called small c conservatives. So I don't think that it's a matter of free speech in this case. I think clearly it's led to increased corruption, which is what everyone argued that it would, and it hasn't led to more transparency. I mean, yes, we know some of what the super PACs are up to and who's funding them, but also we have a lot of instances of, for example, shell corporations giving money. Something like 6 of the 10 largest super PACs raise money from untraceable sources. There was a very good report from Demos about this recently. And what we've also seen as a consequence of the Citizens United decision is that more money is going into these 501c4 organizations, which Lee mentioned, and these are tax-exempt charitable groups that are raising unlimited amounts of money in secret. And so you have a super PAC, let's say you have Karl Rove's super PAC, and then you have Karl Rove's 501c4 organization. And the 501c4 organization of American Crossroads actually raised twice as much money as its super PAC, all of which is from secret donors. And that's also a consequence of the Citizens United decision. And so I think it's been bad on virtually all counts.
The question is directed to Ari. Basically, I think the response is, oh, let's do what they're doing on the left by progressives. And I guess my worry is that what they're doing is fundamentally not democratic. It goes against kind of the spirit of the democratic process. And so sometimes I feel like, and this I think is happening now to some extent, is we have progressives who want to fight and win battles, like a chess game. And then there are people who are democracy advocates who kind of, I think, come into conflict with that approach, And I think we're seeing it, for instance, with Obama's decision to embrace, super PACs as an instance where people are cheering at, great, he's doing it because, we need to win. And then people who are saying, no, that's really bad, because that goes against the principles of democracy. And so I feel that's a real strategic and, I think, in a way, a moral question about, what is the right way to fight this?
Yeah. I think it's pretty complicated. I mean, I'm also not advocating that progressives suddenly turn to the Koch brothers. I mean, the sort of most thing I'm advocating is trying to get money out of politics, which is, to me, it's the most small d democratic thing that you could do. With regards to sort of the Obama campaign's decision to take super PAC money, I mean, it's hard to unilaterally disarm. I mean, I do sort of agree with the Obama campaign on this. I also think that taking super PAC money is going to make it harder for them to then fight the Citizens United decision. So, I mean, I can see both sides of this issue, and I also think that it's more likely that you're going to see Citizens United weakened or repealed under an Obama administration than you are under a Republican administration. Now, I'm not making an argument for the Obama presidency. That's going to be the subject of a million panels on this. I suspect I'm probably perhaps a little bit more favorable to the president than some people in this room might be. But generally speaking, that you have to play both sides of the game. I mean, you have to fund ideas, you have to fund long-term strategies, but you also have to engage in the political process as it is, not as you'd like it to be, and that's somewhat of the dilemma we're facing in the 2012 election right now.
And just a quick addition there, it's just a great thing for small d democratic activists to be moving from just focused on an issue area, like health reform or whatever, and talking instead about these big structural problems in society that kind of screw us all on all of these issues. So, at least starting that conversation and thinking about long-term reform, I think is good for everyone. If you're taking the big money approach and talking to big liberal donors, or just talking in your community about how do we change Citizens United, that's a good thing.
All right, let's go back there. Yeah.
Are the Kochs involved in trying to undermine education below the college level? Aren't they there too? And could you tell us what that is about?
Yeah. So, well, that's part of the ALEC agenda, and it's also been something that the Kochs have long been interested in. And I think the primary way they've been doing it is through voucher programs, which allows kids who are in public schools to get a taxpayer-funded voucher to go to a private school. And that means it's less money for the public school to use for everything. And you know, it basically like is pushing more and more of our taxpayer resources and for education into private entities. And I think that's been the main way that they've been doing it. I know Lee's written a lot about the online efforts to privatize education online. So I don't know if you.
Americans for Prosperity, the Koch group, launched a new effort last year called School Choice Week, and and they get together, PTA groups, Tea Party groups, everyone to come together in the beginning of January and talk about why we need the reforms that Brendan just mentioned. So it's a new effort, and I just don't know how much involved Charles Koch is in this, because there's a lot of overlap. There are a lot of other private school and for-profit online companies that are now funding some of the traditionally Koch groups. So maybe they're renting out their front groups to these for-profit school companies. Maybe they've changed direction because they kind of ideologically, they like charter schools. It's not clear. What is clear is that they've launched a pretty aggressive effort just starting last year.
I want to know at what point in time do people hold to fire the individuals and the institutions to stop saying, well, I could never earn in a year what they're giving me in a month or something like that, or I wouldn't have this center if they didn't do it. I mean, at the best, when you take somebody's money, you're not supposed to dump on them. You may not parrot their line, but you don't dump on them, which is the same as shutting down all the discussion. And I don't see anything to say with those people who are part of our constituency, if you could call it that, who turn the other way and let this go on. Do you have any comments?
So do cultural and intellectual institutions have a responsibility to turn down money that comes from the moral nether regions of America?
I think one of the ways that the Koch brothers have really advanced their agenda is taking advantage of this problem where we don't have institutions coming up with solutions for society. And so if you're a part-time legislator in Tennessee, you might not have a think tank that's helping you write bills. You've got just one, in some states, you just have the legislator and they share one staffer among like 5. And that person's basically just taking phone calls. If you're a part-time legislator, and in some states they earn only $20,000 a year, how do you come up with ideas to fix your state? So that's where the Koch brothers come in, or other corporations like Dow Chemical or Philip Morris. They come in and they fund cultural or think tank institutions that come out and just help them. They say, here's a model legislation, here's a study that helps you out. And this problem, I think, is important for fixing these larger structural flaws. Does the government or some other source of money need to step in and provide that money so we don't see this kind of institutional capture where institutions run out of money and they just have to beg Philip Morris or the Koch brothers to fill the gaps? And we saw the video about the public universities taking so much Koch money. If they're fully funded with it, they wouldn't need to.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, that's been a major consequence of cuts to public institutions and cuts to public services, is that private institutions have had to fill the void. So Kochs are lobbying to defund these institutions, and they're then coming and filling the void. So it's really a twofer for them.
And I think the Kochs will. I think they've been on a PR blitz recently, trying to say that they give all this money to cancer research, they give all this money to the arts, they fund the Lincoln Center. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that, like Lee said, it's so much easier to buy a state legislator than it is to cure cancer. Like, politics is cheap, and they can do that. And like the fact that they're spending so much money and pushing so many really toxic policy agendas is really what we should stay focused on.
So it's okay if there's a gap to take the money.
I didn't say that, but it's a problem, and I don't have a solution.
Yeah, it seems like the answer is that there isn't a good option available.
The good option is to publicly finance these institutions to the point where they don't have to take the the money.
Reverse austerity. Yeah. Let's go down there.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for being here, guys. It's definitely informative. I have 6 things I want to talk to you about. A lot of the things that are described here about what their actions are doing, in my opinion, are kind of along these lines. And the first thing that I've always looked at is trying to figure out how to address a problem when you see it. Well, you have to call it for what it is. So when is the left, on some levels, going to turn around and start looking at maybe this is a fascist movement rather than just a corporatist movement or a greedy movement? It seems like it's getting antithetically political. When are we going to start doing that?
So is there, maybe let's change the premise of the question a little bit. Is there a political advantage in considering movements like this fascistic?
Well, I think I think what your description is accurate, and
this is being taped right now. You realize that?
I mean, and it's wrapped in the American flag. But I mean, I think there's so many. But I think like polemic pushes a lot of people away, and I think there's a lot of really very real and effective things, or there's very real things that they're doing that I think resonate with a lot of people that you can focus on. You can focus on the individual issues, and I think that you don't necessarily have to push people away right away, because there's so many little things you can point out that are really important.
If I was talking to like a swing voter in Ohio, I wouldn't tell them, oh, the Koch brothers are part of a fascist movement. I might say, those napkins you bought are owned by the biggest polluter in the United States. How do you feel about that? So I might take a different tact in terms of trying to win that person over.
Yeah, I'm not sure what portion of the American population has a concept of what fascism means or meant.
I'm just wondering about ALEC. Is the disparity between what corporations pay to be a member and what legislators pay to be a member, which is gigantic, a place that it could be assailed on corruption?
Yeah, I think there's probably claims to be made there.
Can you explain it out a little bit for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't looked as closely into that. I think it would have to be something under, probably under state ethics laws, and that's what we've been looking at the most. I think the scholarships and the way that they operate those are ways that you can attack them. That the scholarships are essentially lobbyists or principals giving money directly to state legislators, and I think lodging ethics complaints state by state that way is one way to do it. I think also they're a 501c3, so they're supposed to do no lobbying. I mean, Common Cause has filed a complaint with the IRS saying basically what they do is lobbying, or they facilitate lobbying. And these are ways that it can be attacked. I don't know specifically about what the law would be where you can find a problem about legislators paying $50 and corporations paying $25,000 to be part of the same organization. Yeah, actually, I guess under ethics law, under ethics laws, state legislators are not supposed to accept anything. They may not necessarily be able to accept anything of value from an organization, and that includes getting a drastically discounted rate. You can't get $500 tickets for $10. So that would be one argument that you could make.
But if you're a C Street guy, you can get room and board in a swanky part of Washington for like $1.50 a month.
Right.
Go for it.
I've got a question for Brendan. My understanding of the recall law in Wisconsin is that not only do you want to say that you're going to recall somebody, but you have to provide a candidate of the opposing party to run against him or her, and then you have to have an actual election, so that even if enough people sign the recall, it doesn't automatically mean that Walker will be out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's so the recall effort is to trigger an election, and they announced the election date last week. It's June 5th, so that'll be. So Walker is officially recalled, but what that does is it triggers a recall election, and we have to go through the election process again. So it's possible that he'll win the election and then he'll still be in office despite having been recalled.
Do they have an opponent yet?
No, there's going to be a primary in early May, and there's probably about 4 candidates who are vying for that Democratic position.
Any good?
I think they're still we're still figuring it out.
I don't understand why there aren't better candidates. I mean, we knew this recall was coming for a year, and the primaries in May and then the elections in June. I mean, it seems like there's been a lot of, like, rightfully so, I guess, cheerleading about the prospect of a recall, but it does seem sort of head confounding that they haven't actually figured out, well, who's going to run in the event of the recall. It's just is this purely due to the indecisiveness of Russ Feingold, or is there something more at work here?
I think that's a big part of it. I think everyone's waiting for Russ Feingold to announce, and he said he won't, but I think everyone's just holding out hope that he will. So I think that's a big part of it.
And there's not a better bench team otherwise?
Not
Tammy's already running.
Yeah.
Gonna let Glenn. She's too Milwaukee.
Aaron Rodgers.
Aaron Rodgers.
I mean, Kathleen Falk is a very strong candidate in a lot of ways. She's very, very strong on environmental, women's rights. She signed a pledge to restore collective bargaining as part of any budget bill that she'd sign. I think they're going to be very, very strong candidates no matter what. What's going on in Wisconsin? The entire sea is shifting there in terms of this populist progressive uprising that's ongoing. There's going to be candidates that are going to be pushed to do more progressive things than anything we would have imagined. I'd say the biggest debate that we'll see is whether or not Mayor Tom Barrett would be the candidate versus someone like Kathleen Falk. Barrett lost of Milwaukee. He lost to Scott Walker last year. Very much not strong on union rights, and has a too strong of a relationship with people like Rahm Emanuel. So it's the primary on May 8th will be very impactful. So keep an eye on it.
The first part of your remarks were very encouraging.
Well, the panel in general, just when I look at how, say, the Bush administration and, say, Republicans in general, how they attack entities like Acorn, when I look at the Obama administration, I don't know if the issue is they're more corporate Democrats, that's why they aren't really doing anything more specifically to address these particular issues dealing with the Koch brothers. And even if you did have a super PAC with a large amount of cash being put into the elections, do you really think the Democrats will really push a progressive agenda anyway? Or will we really have something that's very similar to what's on the right by Democrats and not having the progressive or left agenda being addressed at all?
I don't have a full response to that at all, but I will say one interesting thing about the Koch brothers that is not discussed is that they fund Democrats as well. They funded a lot of Senate Democrats in the last 2 cycles that took their approach on climate and taxes and a couple other issues. Another big factor that's not discussed on the left or in the press is that the Democratic Leadership Council, this organization founded some 20 or so years ago to move the Democratic Party to the right on economic issues, away from the labor and community organizations, that sort of thing. It was founded by a set of corporate lobbyists, although you kind of think of, Al Gore and Clinton and Lieberman as the face of the organization. But behind the scenes, it was a group of lobbyists, most of them from Wall Street and pharma. But that guy I mentioned in the very beginning of my talk, Richard Fink, the lobbyist for Koch, who helped design their industrial process of advancing the Koch agenda, he was one of the founding members of the DLC and helped funnel money there. So he helped move the Democratic Party to the right with this very influential organization, which isn't as influential now, but it certainly has affected the Democratic Party for a very long time.
That's right, and the Democrats who are primarily in control of Obama's cabinet, and also who sort of ushered him into his days in the Senate, are all sort of DLC holdovers.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's definitely a longer conversation that I'm sure will be taken up by other panels. Here, I mean, I imagine, Brendan, you would say in Wisconsin there was a pretty big difference when the Democrats were in power versus the Republicans were in power. And I was talking to Howard Dean recently, the former head of the Democratic Party, and Dean told me that, well, Washington might not be able to help you, but it can really hurt you. And to an extent, that's what we're seeing. I mean, we are in a lesser of two evil system, but the evil can get pretty magnified at times.
Which is how come he went from advocating for bike paths in Vermont to being a shill for a biotech company.
Thinking back to the Liberty League, which is sort of like the beginning of stuff like this back in the 30s, the DuPont's heading it up.
Liberty League had real problems with credibility because people knew where the money was coming from. And in a sort of anti-corporate decade, that sort of sunk them. So are the Koch brothers being too successful to the point that people now know who they are and what they're doing, because of the journalistic work that you do? And then secondly, that their success of them and groups like that have so pushed Republican Party politics to the right that we're seeing what we're seeing now, which is creating a right-wing Republican Party that the majority of the country is not going to like. So do you think any of that's happening, and do you think the Koch brothers are aware of it, if so, and are reacting in terms of their strategy?
So have the Kochs built a bridge too far?
Yeah.
Is there a little overreach in the Koch brothers?
Let me address your first comment. I think the big difference between now and the 1930s is that you had Senator Hugo Black from Alabama meet with President Roosevelt and said, these Liberty League guys, they're dangerous because, like the Koch brothers, they created dozens of front groups to oppose the New Deal. And what Senator Black did, and I think a lot of liberals would feel kind of cautious about this today, I guess because of McCarthy or whatever, but he investigated them ruthlessly. Senator Black called them to Congress, the DuPont brothers, and a lot of other big business industrialists who were funding all of these front groups against the New Deal. They had like a farmers group. They actually had a Minutemen group, just like we think they had a Minutemen against like the New Deal. But Senator Black was ruthless. He contacted Western Union, got them on a type of a monopoly accusation, like saying that they were fixing prices, that sort of thing, and then used that to investigate and subpoena their telegrams. And then used that information and started reading them on the floor, just exposing group after group after group, and just causing a national sensation. And this was in the 2 years before Roosevelt's first re-election. And that was a game changer, because you had Alf Landon, the Republican nominee, basically handpicked by the DuPont brothers and running on a Liberty League ticket. But as Senator Black and several other members of Congress back then, and the Roosevelt political machine, they didn't even bother running against Alf Landon. They just ran against the DuPont brothers and all these folks who destroyed the economy in the Great Depression, and now we're funding all these front groups. And you don't see that on the left now. You didn't see President Obama calling these institutional forces out, not just the Koch brothers. He should have called out Peabody Coal and really confronted some of these Wall Street actors who are still under TARP, funding all these lobbying campaigns against Dodd-Frank and what have you. You just didn't see that aggressive nature that you saw back then.
I think that's partly because they need to raise money from some of those very institutions. And I also, there has been an effort, particularly by the Obama campaign, to criticize the Koch brothers more recently for driving up gas prices and also funding a lot of the Tea Party, and the Kochs have responded pretty aggressively. I mean, you could talk about this more because you've been at their gatherings, but they are very, very sensitive from a PR perspective, and I do get the sense that they're a bit on the defensive, at least on the PR front. I don't know how it's going to translate into the policy realm, but they are aware of what people are saying about them.
Yeah, I mean, in last year, when the Koch brothers were called out, a lot of it because of the Wisconsin stuff, the prank call, and then just it raised the name ID of the Koch brothers finally. New Yorker article from Jane Mayer made a big contribution. A lot of the stuff came together, and in early 2011, they hired 12 PR firms to start going after folks. If you Google my name, you'll see lots of articles about how I'm a liar. And because they hired, I don't want to go into too many of the details, but they hired a private investigator. They hired Michael Goldfarb, who's the editor of the Weekly Standard, but he also has his own PR firm, to just smear their critics. So they're very sensitive about this stuff, and I've been violently kicked out of some of their events, and other times just told to leave, because they don't want this type of scrutiny, and they know that they'd rather have this election about crazy Obama conspiracy theories, not about this billionaire who's super selfish.
Crazy right-wing conspiracy theories.
Well, I wouldn't call it a conspiracy unless it's true. So, but they are sensitive. Will that prevent them from spending more? Actually, it might do the opposite. They might actually get more aggressive. So.
Yeah.
Well, this last discussion actually is very consistent with what I was going to say. That I think there's something to be said for the view that if progressives do support Democrats in lesser evil politics, it frees them up to move to the right, and it really hasn't been effective as a strategy going back as long as my lifetime. So I think that it's, you know, Occupy did a wonderful, and really has set a fantastic alternative to that by saying to people, let's get out in the street, let's be an independent force, and not be supporting either of the corporate parties, and not just get involved in that, but ask the people to oppose both of those parties and get involved themselves. And I think that to the extent we can maintain that strategy, we have the best alternative to putting pressure on the Democrats to listen to and I think that was very effective in changing the discourse.
So to make that about the Kochs, do you foresee a sort of people's protest movement as opposed to movement among left-wing donors and the Soroses of the world and the sort of inside the Beltway class? Would that be a sort of an effective countermeasure to the influence of Kochs and Koch-like groups?
I mean, I think we're seeing it. I mean, I think we're seeing it now. I think Koch, the Koch name being attached to any group or any policy is becoming increasingly toxic, and I think that is effective.
I mean, I think that you have to do both. I think you have to work within the political system, and I think you also have to change the dynamics of the political system, like Occupy Wall Street did. And I don't think you can just do one and believe that you've accomplished your goal. Because, I mean, the fact is we are, for better or worse, basically in a two-party system. And so if you just, criticize the Democratic Party and that's all you do, and then you don't vote, well, that creates a huge vacuum. And who's going to fill that vacuum? People like the Koch brothers are going to fill the vacuum. And as someone who's reported a lot on voting rights, just to see all these restrictions in terms of the right to vote, I think it would be terrible for progressives to then decide not to vote, which are just going to allow more and more of these type of restrictions to pass. And people who want to have a say in the political process will have a reduced say because some like-minded people decided that for reasons of protest they weren't going to vote. And I would also just add that the Citizens United decision, which I think is the worst thing that's happened in the country in terms of with regards to the Supreme Court, probably wouldn't have happened if there was a different president in 2000. Now, that's not an endorsement of Al Gore. I'm just saying I don't think an Al Gore Supreme Court would have given us the Citizens United decision. So I think that's something to think about.
Fascinating. I think that we'll take one more and then we'll move to you, Chris. Okay, wonderful. Okay, fight. Just kidding. Let's hear from you. You get the last.
Yeah, considering the amount of signatures that they've gotten through the recall, like in Ohio where they got that on bill now for the repeal of collective bargaining, and what's going on in Wisconsin where they've almost gotten enough signatures that matches what he got in votes, and the political climate, I would think Alan Grayson's comment of money can't vote is very relevant to this. So how do you feel about that?
Feel about Grayson's comment that money can't vote?
Yeah, and considering the amount of signatures that they're getting with the recalls, and then the people
so
turning out.
Are there limits to the effects that big money can have on?
Considering the political climate that is now, with the signatures they're about to get.
Does the efficacy graph plateau?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are 1 million people in Wisconsin who are really fired up, but there's about 5 million people in the state, so. There's probably a million who are really fired up against Walker, 1 million who are fired up against him, and then there's going to be, a solid 5 or 10% who are undecided. And I don't know how they're undecided, but I've been paying attention, and I think just a lot of people haven't. So I think that's where the money really comes in. That's where the money's effective, because they're going to be swayed one way. They're going to be swayed in one direction or the other, and there's going to be something that's doing the swing. And I think if you keep hearing the same messages over and over on TV, on web banners, on the radio, then I think that's really, really effective. I think it's just something psychologically about hearing the same message over and over that has an impact. And I think that's what money can really buy.
I mean, those with the most amount of money win 90% of elections, so that's all you really need to know. And not only that, but the money decides what pieces of legislation are being proposed, what's being voted on. It decides what the pieces of legislation look like. So, I mean, it impacts every single aspect of the electoral process, which is not to say that we can't get some sort of people-powered movement in that system. It just makes it harder for a people-powered movement to succeed.
Well, I also feel, you know, they turned out to put Obama in, they didn't turn out to keep him in, but I think he's got the movement with him now to keep that momentum going. We hope.
We'll see. All right, chair's prerogative. We're done with that portion of the panel. I'm so sorry if you have other questions. Well, here we are. You can tweet them at any of us. What's it?
Do you have any more of the booklets on their path to power?
I haven't got a thing.
Thank you.
So, Chris, I guess I'm going to turn it over to you, Chris Kibler of Big Apple Coffee Party.
Sure.
And thanks to our...
Yeah, first, thanks. Really glad that Jesse brought the question up, what can we do? And then Ari kind of raised the bar by the boycott, because Big Apple Coffee Party has been doing just that. So for the past 5 months or so, we've done beta testing, and we've actually gone on a campaign which we call Don't Do Coke, educational campaign. So as Ari mentioned, you know, Brawny paper towels are made by Georgia Pacific, which the Koch Brothers own, which I guess, so if you buy Brawny paper towels, a certain percentage of it is going to the Tea Party. Dixie cups, Dixie plates, Mardi Gras, Quilted Northern, you know, Quilted Northern toilet paper is owned by the Koch brothers. So we have these flyers. Please take as many as you want. Our website is on the back where you can, you or your organization can come and download as many flyers as you want. And it's a great, we think it's a great way for people to learn about the Koch brothers. We have the products in the front, about the Koch brothers on the back. And also we have a table downstairs to come talk to us about this if you want. So thanks again, guys. These guys traveled really far to be here, so thanks a lot.
Thank you all for coming, and enjoy your next 70 panels.